Right now, without realizing it, you are hearing something that isn't there. Not a loud hallucination, not a sign of anything wrong, just a quiet, persistent sound that your brain manufactures entirely on its own, filling in the gaps where silence should be. And the moment you sit in a truly quiet room, you will notice it. A faint ringing, a soft hiss, a low hum that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That's not the room. That's your brain refusing to accept silence. And the reason why is far stranger, far older, and far more revealing than most people ever find out. So why is your brain so afraid of silence that it will literally invent sounds to fill it? The answer starts somewhere you might not expect. It starts with what silence actually meant to your ancestors. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human auditory system evolved in an environment that was never truly silent. Wind moved through trees. Water ran somewhere nearby. Birds called to each other. Insects created an unbroken wall of sound from dusk to dawn. Silence, in the natural world, is not peaceful. It is a warning. When the birds stop calling, something has disturbed them. When the insects go quiet, something large is moving nearby. When the usual ambient sound of a familiar environment suddenly drops out, every animal in that environment goes on alert. Silence for your ancestors was the sound of a predator. And your brain, shaped by millions of years of that reality, never fully unlearned this lesson. This is why complete silence makes most people profoundly uncomfortable. Not because they are anxious or broken, but because deep inside the oldest structures of the brain, silence still carries the same message it always has. Something is wrong. Pay attention. Now. But the brain doesn't just respond to silence with anxiety. It responds with something far more active. It fills the silence in. This phenomenon has a name. It's called phantom sound perception, and its most well-known form is tinnitus. That ringing, hissing, buzzing, or humming in your ears that an estimated 15% of the global population experiences on a regular basis. For a long time, doctors assumed tinnitus was simply damage to the ear, a broken input system sending false signals. But research, particularly work by neuroscientist Joseph Rauschecker at Georgetown University, has dramatically complicated that picture. Rauschecker and his colleagues found that in many cases of tinnitus, the ears are functioning normally. The problem isn't in the ear at all, it's in the brain. Specifically, it's in what happens when the auditory cortex, the region of your brain that processes sound, stops receiving its expected input. Think of it this way. Your auditory cortex has been receiving a constant stream of sound information your entire life. Billions of tiny signals every second of every day since before you were born. When that stream suddenly drops, the auditory cortex doesn't go quiet. It goes looking. It increases its own sensitivity, cranking up its internal gain, essentially turning up its own volume in an attempt to detect the signal it's no longer receiving. And in the process, it begins amplifying its own background neural noise. That noise becomes the sound you hear. The ringing isn't coming from your ears. It's coming from your brain's desperate attempt to hear something in the silence. But this goes much deeper than tinnitus. Researcher Diana Deutsch at the University of California, San Diego has spent decades studying a phenomenon she calls the speech-to-song illusion and other auditory perceptual illusions, demonstrating how profoundly the brain actively constructs the sounds we hear rather than passively receiving them. The brain, her research shows, is not a recording device. It is an editor, a storyteller, a system that takes fragmentary, incomplete input and weaves it into a coherent, continuous experience, filling in gaps, smoothing over inconsistencies, and in many cases, adding things that were never there. This is why you can hear your name in a crowd of people talking, even when nobody said it. This is why you can sometimes mishear a song lyric and then never unhear the wrong version. This is why people living alone often report hearing voices, footsteps, or their phone ringing when none of those things occurred. The brain expects a certain level of auditory input. When reality fails to provide it, the brain provides its own. Now here is where the story gets genuinely strange. In 2004, musician and composer John Cage made one of the most famous artistic statements in the history of music. He entered an anechoic chamber, a room specifically engineered to absorb nearly 100% of all sound, and famously reported hearing two distinct sounds, a high-pitched sound and a low-pitched sound. When he mentioned this to the engineer told him that the high sound was his nervous system in operation and the low sound was his blood circulating. The anechoic chamber, the closest thing to true silence that human engineering has ever produced, didn't give Cage silence. It gave him his own body as a soundscape. True silence, it turns out, is functionally impossible for a living human being to experience. Because the moment the external world goes quiet, the internal world gets louder. Your heartbeat, your breath, the faint electrical hum of your own nervous system. And beneath all of that, the auditory cortex, deprived of its input, beginning to generate its own. Researcher Robert Zatorre at McGill University has demonstrated through brain imaging studies that simply imagining a piece of music activates many of the same neural circuits that actually hearing the music does. The brain's auditory system doesn't sharply distinguish between real sound and constructed sound in the way we might expect, which means the line between hearing and imagining is far thinner than most people realize. When you mishear something, that isn't a failure of your hearing. It is your brain making an editorial decision, substituting what it expected to hear for what was actually said. When you hear a sound in an empty house that turns out not to be there, that isn't a ghost. That is your auditory cortex doing exactly what it was designed to do. Detecting patterns, completing signals, refusing to accept that the environment has gone quiet. Because in the world your brain was built for, an environment that went quiet was an environment preparing to kill you. And there is one more dimension to this that almost nobody talks about. Silence doesn't just make the brain invent sounds, it makes the brain louder in every sense. Research by psychologist Leah Purge and others studying the effects of enforced silence on cognitive function has found that periods of silence, real silence, not meditation or white noise or ambient sound, produce measurable increases in hippocampal activity, the region of the brain most associated with memory consolidation and the growth of new neurons. In other words, when the brain is deprived of external sensory input, it turns inward, and in doing so, it begins doing some of its most important work. Memory processing, emotional integration, the quiet consolidation of everything that happened during the day. The default mode network, a system of brain regions that activates when you're not focused on the external world, lights up powerfully in silence. And this network is associated not with rest, but with some of the most complex cognitive activity the brain performs. Self-reflection, future planning, the construction of personal narrative. Your brain doesn't rest in silence. It goes to work. So we are left with a strange and beautiful paradox. Silence terrifies the brain. It has terrified it since before the first human being ever spoke a word. And so the brain fills silence with sound, with phantom noise, with the hiss and ring of its own internal machinery, with the echo of things it expected to hear and didn't. And yet, inside that same silence, in the space between the invented sounds, something extraordinary is happening. The brain is remembering, growing, integrating, becoming, in some measurable way, more itself. The thing your brain is most afraid of may also be the thing it needs most. So the next time you sit in a quiet room and hear that faint ringing that has no source, or mistake the settling of a house for footsteps, or hear your name in a crowd that wasn't calling you, don't be unnerved. That is 400,000 years of survival instinct, doing what it was built to do. Listening for the predator in the silence, still on guard, still searching, still refusing, after all this time, to let the world go quiet.